When you back into 2 Samuel, you start to see that the first 4 chapters, somewhere in your notes around the first 4 chapters, you should make the note, David becomes king over Judah. He's not king over Israel. He's not king over 10 tribes. He's king over 2. As king over Judah, he's going to eventually build into the confederation. And in chapter 5, we're going to start to see where he starts to take over the rest of the country. Now, if you look very closely in chapter 1, you see that David comes through a time when he sings over the loss of Saul and he sings over the loss of Jonathan. And then in chapter 2, he begins to seek God's direction. And what you find is in 2:1 through 4, David becomes prayerful as he seeks God. If I had a single word for 2:1 through 4, it would be prayerful. He's looking at the situation, and he recognizes that there's a problem, and he inquires of the Lord. That's what we would call prayer. And he says, God, do I go up? Do I go up to one of the cities of Judah? The Lord says, go up. Where do I go? Go to Hebron. So this is him carefully, intimately, sensitively seeking God. Now, that's a great moment for David, because not all Dave's moments look like that. By the way, not all of yours do either. Not all of mine do either. And so when you get to verses 5 through 7, what you see is that there's a certain kind of encouragement that flows out of David as he seeks God's direction. Look at the encouragement he gives. He sends messengers out to Jabesh of Gilead, and in order to establish David in Judah, David compliments and encourages other people who are doing right things. Why? Because on your way to leadership, one of the things you need to develop is the ability to encourage people who are following God and walking and doing rightly. Develop that, because no leader will ever become what God wants them to become if you cannot learn to encourage what God is doing in other people. Leadership is about inspiring them, but you don't have to inspire them with a fleshly inspiration. You can call them to greatness in God if you encourage them in God. So in verses 5, 6, and 7, what he does is he says, man, God is really using you. Now may the Lord show his loving kindness and truth to you. So you see David calling on God and encouraging them in scriptural and biblical ways. And then you get down to verses 8 through 32, and there's this big, long time period where David could be tempted to grab control over the other people. Look, there's a weakness. David has men. David has a track record. David is alive. Saul's dead. Jonathan's dead. David is a known quantity. People sing about David. David has killed his tens of thousands. David is popular. Saul is dead. This is the moment that he could step in and take over. There is every temptation for David to take control, but he doesn't. And in chapter 2, what happens is rather people stand up on his behalf and fight on his behalf, but not at his behest. What do I mean? David's not behind the rise of David. David's not in the story. It's men of David who are fighting men of Saul and Saul's household. And who is the second ruler after Saul, technically, of the 10 tribes that David is not in charge of? Ishbosheth. And Ishbosheth is a man that rises to this place but never earns the respect of the people around him. Rather, there's an explosion, as it were, in chapter 2. And what we saw in chapter 2 was that there was an attempt to gain control. There was a wrestling over control. Here's what I want you to walk away with. End of chapter 2. David isn't wrestling for control. People are doing it on his behalf. And I want you to understand something. You're going to see that David's servants and servants of Ishbosheth or servants of the house of Saul. This isn't about David versus Ishbosheth. This is about people taking on their names. One of the things that happens as you rise in leadership is people grab onto your persona and they use it for their cause. And one of the things that I've noticed in leadership across the country, you see this. People will speak in the name of a leader that aren't that leader. And in truth, very often they don't represent him well. So it's hard to know when somebody comes out as a spokesman for David if that's David's opinion. Let's say it that way. Now, when you get into chapter 3, I want you to go back now and settle to David. It's because the second half of chapter 2 is really about people around David, people speaking for David, or people of the administration, future administration of David. But you get to chapter 3, and it says there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. So you get a feeling at the beginning of chapter 3 that this is a long, protracted process, right? I want you to step back and see something. David grew steadily stronger in verse 1, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. This isn't a statement of David somehow acquiring strength of his own merits. This is God strengthened David's hand and weakened the household of Saul and Ishbosheth's hands. And what happens is you see David first at Hebron, and he's with, his firstborn is Amnon by Ahinoam, second Chileab by Abigail, third Absalom by Maachah, the daughter of Talmai, who's king of Geshur, the fourth Adonijah, son of Haggith, the fifth Shephatiah, the son of Avital, and the sixth Ithream by David's wife Eglah, and these were born to David at Hebron. Now, why is that necessary for you to know? Well, first of all, each of these guys, the prince's household of Judah is being established here. But there's something else. There's also a sense of a real positive time in David's life. I want you to read the beginning of chapter 3 and feel like this is a good time. Baby after baby is being born. His household is growing and being strengthened. He has, when a king or a person of this kind of rank has many wives, what does that mean? He's gaining power with his people of the country roundabout as he's taking on more treaties and more alliances. So what you see in 3:1-5 is not just a guy having lots of babies. What you see is David is building strength. This is about alliances, but it's also about joy. David has one baby born to him after another. David is hearing a lot of crying in the night watches. Now, he's really not there doing that somewhere else, but, you know, just metaphorically. And he's seeing his household increase. And at this point, you have to remember, we've been years since the anointing in 1 Samuel 16. We've been at least a dozen years of running. Now David appears to be stationary, stable. He seems to be being blessed by God with children, with alliances, with wives. This is all positive. Now, the next step in verses 6-16 is David has to show prudence. To be prudent means to be wise in action. And he's got to put out some prudent walks now. The next thing that's going to happen is there is tension in verse 1, there's blessing in verses 2-5, and now prudence in verses 6-16. Now take a look at verse 6. It says, it came about, there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. What's happening is Abner is emerging in the house of Saul as the representative of Saul's legacy. Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, and Ishbosheth said to Abner, why have you gone into my father's concubine? Abner was very angry over the words of Ishbosheth and said, am I a dog's head that belongs to Judah? Today I show kindness to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not delivered you into the hands of David. And yet today you charge me with a guilt concerning the woman. What is he saying? The background of verse 8 is simple. Abner's rising. Ishbosheth, who is on the throne for a couple of years after Saul, says to him, why did you go into my concubine? And Abner says, I'm stronger than you. Shut up. You better dial it back, big guy, because I can take you out. What you have is a form of insurgency, but it's done verbally. It's not done actively. And then sleeping with a concubine, what Abner's doing is ratcheting up his own stake in the household of the king. So let's just say it this way. Saul's dynasty is under threat without David. It's not, what you saw in verses 2 through 5 is David's dynasty is growing. Saul's is under threat in its own house. And then you get to verse 9, may God do so to Abner and more also, if as the Lord has sworn to David, I do not accomplish this for him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and to establish the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan even to Beersheba. And he could no longer answer Abner a word because he was afraid of him. Ishbosheth is on the throne, afraid of his own kingdom. So David is growing in freedoms and alliances, and Ishbosheth is shutting down. Why? He's afraid of the captain of his own guard, who has looked right at him and said, you shut up or I'll turn this over to David. You've got nothing without me. So in a way, you can be president or king and locked in your own palace. Ishbosheth's life is hard at this point. And what's interesting is verse 11, it says he could no longer answer him. And then verse 12, Abner sent messengers to David in his place saying, whose is the land? Make your covenant with me, and behold, my hand shall be with you to bring all Israel over to you. So there's an intrigue statement here. It's interesting because Abner has already stepped over top of the king he was supposed to be defending. When you get somebody who's that slippery, should you just jump into an agreement with them? It might be worth noting the character of the person you're dealing with, right? In verse 13, he said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but I will demand one thing of you, namely, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see me. David is still lacking his wife, his very first wife, and he's asking for Abner to bring Michal back to him. David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son. Give me my wife Michal, to whom I was betrothed for 100 foreskins of Philistines. Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband, from Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping as he went. This is a pathetic looking character in Scripture. And followed her as far as Bachorim, the place of the weeping. And then Abner said to him, go, return. So he returned. Yet what you see is something interesting. David wanted Michal returned. It was both an official step and it was a way of making sure that they're going to be sincere about what they're making. They need a public statement, a public agreement. Today we would use a press conference and say, get up in front of people and in the press, say it out loud. That's not going to work back then, so what they need is a symbol. And Michal becomes this political football. But in a very real sense, there's something else going on. Somebody read 17 to 21, nice and loud.
Now Abner had consultation with the elders of Israel, saying, in times past you were seeking for David to be king over you. Now then do it, for the Lord has spoken of David, saying, by the hand of my servant David I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from the hand of all their enemies. Abner also spoke in the hearing of Benjamin, and in addition Abner went to speak in the hearing of David in Hebron, all that seemed good to Israel, and to the whole house of Benjamin. Then Abner and 20 men with him came to David at Hebron. And David made a feast for Abner and to the men who were with him. Abner said to David, let me arise and go and gather all Israel to my lord the king, that you may make a covenant, that they may make a covenant with you, and that you may be king over all that your soul desires. So David sent Abner away, and he went in peace.
There's a personal exchange between Abner and David. And if you take a look at it, Abner comes representing a consultation with elders from the tribes. There's a kind of an informal tribal agreement. And Abner comes and says, hey, let me go back. I'll bring under all the tribes of Israel. The problem is they're not Abner's to give. Abner's double dealing his own prince. So in a sense, this is not the upstanding character you want him to be. David, on the other hand, decides, you know what? I'm not going to play this out. I'm going to let someone else play this out. So he says, well, that's fine. If you're going to bring me all of the heads of the tribes of the north, that'll be fine. I'll be glad to take them on. And it says in verse 22, behold, the servants of David and Joab came from a raid and brought much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David in Hebron, for he had sent him away, and he had gone in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him arrived, they told Joab, saying, Abner, the son of Ner, came to the king, and he has sent him away, and he's gone in peace. Joab came to the king and said, what have you done? Behold, Abner came to you. Why then have you sent him away? And he's already gone. You know Abner, son of Ner, that he came to deceive you and to learn of your going out and coming in and to find out all that you're doing. So Joab is saying, you have left yourself unprotected. But there's a certain settledness in David that doesn't exist in all the others. What is it? David seems to grasp that God is going to use him. And so he plays his cards very carefully, but he's not worried about everything. He has a sense in which this is going to play out. So verse 26 says, when Joab came to David, he sent messengers after Abner. They brought him back from the well of Sirah, but David did not know it. Notice that. David doesn't know what his men are doing. So both Ishbosheth and David have to learn that people will do actions in their names that will pick up with their reputation even if they aren't involved. This is one of the problems of running a campaign. You find out that if you have a spokesman and your spokesman slips up, it's your words. You may not have been there when they were said, but you're going to own them. And so now there's a lot going on. But notice that this kingdom isn't really a kingdom yet. It's tribes, and people aren't quite sure who to follow and what to do. If the Philistines attacked right now, it would be a mess. Fortunately, the Egyptians are still stalemated. So as a result, they're not having to face world powers at this point. There's a little bit of jockeying room. Now it says that, so when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the middle of the gate to speak with him privately. And there he struck him in the belly so that he died on account of the blood of Asahel, his brother. Afterwards, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are innocent before the Lord forever of the blood of Abner the son of Ner. May it fall on the head of Joab and all his father's household, and may there not fail from the house of Joab one who has a discharge, or who is a leper, or who takes hold of a distaff, one who falls by the sword, or who lacks bread. So Joab and Abishai his brother killed Abner because he had put their brother Asahel to death in the battle at Gibeon. It's interesting because what David says is, I need a public statement. I had nothing to do with Abner's death. And in fact, I'm going to call on God to curse the man who did it. Now, he doesn't hate Joab, but he's got no choice. There's blood now on the household of David. He's just getting started. He's just seeing his sons born. He doesn't want this. David did not want to take over the tribes through blood. He felt bonded to them. He felt related to them. He didn't want to make them knuckle under. That's not what he's trying to do. The problem is, when you become a leader, people will act with your voice, even when you're not the one speaking. I can tell you it's frustrating from a leadership standpoint when people go out and they say things as though you agree with them, but you didn't say them. And that's one of the things. So already David has an expanding household, a positive view of life, a sense that God is blessing him, and then a constant problem. People acting in his name, doing things he didn't tell them to do. And then you get down to verse 31, it says, David said to Joab, to all of the people who are with him, tear your clothes, gird on sackcloth, lament before Abner. And David walked behind the bier, the platform on which they were carrying the body. Thus they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king lifted up his voice and wept at the grave of Abner, and all the people wept. The king chanted a lament for Abner and said, should Abner die as a fool dies, your hands were not bound, nor your feet put in fetters. As one falls before the wicked, you have fallen. And all the people wept over him. So David composes a hot hit. He does what he does well. He composes a song. He makes a public show of, I am not for this. I am broken over it. But guys, did it help David? was this going to help David? Ishbosheth's strength was Abner, and Abner was dead. Did it help Ishbosheth? Actually, it did. But that's the backstory, and not that many people knew that in the house of the north. David knew it because Abner had come to him and said, I'm going to trade my prince for you. So David knew it, but the people didn't know it. Rather than David expose all the backstory, what he did was he publicly mourned the death of Abner. Is that hypocritical? I don't think so. I think he legitimately thought, this is not the way I wanted this to go. I did not want you to defend me by killing brothers. So verse 35, then all the people came to persuade David to eat bread while it was still day. But David vowed, saying, may God do so to me, and more also if I taste bread or anything else before the sun goes down. All the people took note of it, and it pleased them, just as everything the king did pleased all the people. Put a box around verse 36, because that's David is being sincere in his walk, but it's playing out politically to his benefit. There are politicians that will do political stunts for political power. David turns and legitimately cares, weeps, sings, cries, mourns, fasts, and people say, that's real. And when they see David being authentic, it's the authenticity that raises his stock. As a leader, what does that do? In other words, when you find that people have acted badly on your behalf and you mourn authentically, people will pick out what's you and what's someone else. That's what David is hoping for. Verse 37, all the people understood that day that it had not been the will of the king to put Abner, son of Ner, to death. David solved the problem by humility. David solved the problem not by blustering, but by bowing. And verse 38, then the king said to his servants, do you not know that a prince and a great man has fallen this day in Israel? I am weak today, though anointed king, and these men, the sons of Zeruiah, are too difficult for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil. Now, there's a danger in David becoming physically weak and in calling out Joab and the sons of Zeruiah and saying they were murderers and they were wrong. The political reality is that people love David for it. But what's the other problem? He just called out his Joint Chiefs of Staff general at the head of his armies and said he's a murderer. How's that going to play? How's that going to work? So it looked like he was out there representing David. Now he's clear. The people know it didn't represent David. But now it's going to leave Joab and David pitted against one another. So whereas we began the chapter, did you notice in the early part of the chapter, after we got through David having babies and all of that, the next part of the chapter was Ishbosheth and Abner. Starts off with Ishbosheth and Abner having difficulty. By the end of the chapter, it's Joab and David having difficulty. So there's a shifting of this. Here's what you should take away from chapter 3. With the rise of power and the consolidation, David becomes popular, but people act in his name. And David doesn't always have control of his own administration. Why? He's just getting started. David has learned how to be an insurgent, how to run around and sneak into caves and hide. What he hasn't learned is how to get people to get in line and march according to orders. He doesn't have that yet. This isn't a kingdom yet. It's a cobbled together group of people that are swearing allegiance to somebody and then changing sides and swearing allegiance to the other guy and killing the first guy. It's not stable yet. David doesn't want it. David wants to be king a la the anointing of Samuel all the way back in 1 Samuel 16, not David shedding blood. Why? Because through Saul's life, God taught David not to try to get the throne by blood. And David wasn't going to walk away from the lessons. So let's end chapter 3 with this. When you take the early lessons of God in your life and you apply them, right now in your life, you're learning things and you don't know why you're learning them. Right now, you're going to watch somebody fail in their marriage, and it's going to hurt you. And what that's going to do is protect your marriage later. What God is doing is teaching you through the lives of other people, through experiences you don't control. And suddenly you're out and you're trying to figure out, what was that experience? Guys, let me be personal for a minute. For years of my life, there were two pieces. There was a piece that was over in Israel and a piece that was over here. And they didn't fit together. And I couldn't figure out why God used this time in Israel, then jerked me back over here, and I had two lives and I couldn't bring them together. It was a dozen or so years in which God moved one into the other. I understand what He's doing in my life now at 54, but I didn't at 24. I didn't get it. So if for a while, if for a decade or two of your life, a series of experiences are happening that don't quite fit together, seek God, because here's what will happen. Eventually you'll find out how the roads lead together. In the beginning, you're going to meet people and weird things will happen. You'll walk away from that circumstance and say, God, what was that? Why did I do that? And He's going to say, in a decade, you'll know. I make better decisions now as a leader because of things that happened to me 2 decades ago. And I make bad decisions as a leader because of things that I don't learn from things that happened to me 2 decades ago. Now, look at chapter 4, because this problem is going to keep rolling. Officially, David is king of Judah. Ishbosheth is king of 10 tribes. He has the allegiance of 10 tribes. Those 10 tribes have backroom dealt through Abner to come over to David. So Abner dies, and where is the agreement? What happens now? So you get to chapter 4, and here's what I want you to note. It's politically in flux. Nobody knows who's going to emerge being in charge. It's fine for us, after having read the scriptures, and to know David's household wins, but they don't know that yet. They're in the middle of this topsy-turvy, and people are moving for alliances and allegiances, and it's all politics. And then you get to chapter 4, and I want you to see a story of David trying to be consistent in the middle of an ever-moving chessboard. Somebody read the 12 verses of chapter 4 nice and loud.
Saul's son heard that Abner had died in Hebron. He lost courage, and all Israel was disturbed. Saul's son had 2 men who were commanders of the bands. The name of one was Benah, and the name of the other Rechab, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, of the sons of Benjamin. For Beeroth was also considered part of Benjamin, and all the Beerothites fled to Gitam and have been aliens there until this day. Now Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened that in a hurry to flee, he fell and became lame, and his name was
Mephibosheth.
So the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, Rechab and Benah, departed and came to the house of Ishbosheth in the heat of the day when he was taking his midday rest. They came to the middle of the houses to get the wheat, and they struck him in the belly, and Rechab and Benah his brother escaped. Now when they came into the house, as he was lying on his bed in his bedroom, they struck him and killed him and beheaded him. And they took his head and traveled by way of their Arabah all night. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. Thus the Lord has given my lord the king vengeance to stay on Saul and his descendants. David answered Rechab and Benah, his brothers, sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, and said to them, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, when one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him in Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more then, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I now require his blood from your hand and destroy you from the earth? Then David commanded the young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet, and hung them up beside the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the grave of Abner in Hebron.
Okay, what you just saw was intrigue in the palace of Ishbosheth, if you want to call it a palace. What you see is at the very beginning of the chapter that when Abner had died, Ishbosheth lost all sense of direction and courage. He's now quivering. He's the head of your 10 tribes, and he's quivering over the loss of one man. But wait. There were 2 other strong men that he could have turned to. He could have showed strength and led. Instead, he quivered, and those men who were part of the military establishment had no place in their heart for a quivering guy. They didn't respect him. So as a result, in verse 2, you see that these 2 men that were commanders of the band, Baanah and Rechab, become, they disrespect Ishbosheth out of the gate. They know already that this guy isn't going to be prepared to lead them. In verse 4, it says that Jonathan, or Jonathan, Saul's son, also had a son. So the grandson of Saul also lived. Ishbosheth, and now a grandson. You have a son, and now you have a grandson. And the grandson has a problem. When he was 5 years old, there was a report that came, and he ended up falling, and he damaged his legs, and he couldn't walk properly. He was lame, and his name was, and Mephibosheth is to cut away the shame. Ishbosheth, man of shame. Mephibosheth, Bosh's shame, to cut away the shame. And what's interesting is this young cripple now is going to rise because Ishbosheth is falling. Now, they don't, what's interesting, it says that they come and they come to the house of Ishbosheth. They come in the midday when everybody's resting in verse 5. And in verse 6, they come in like they were coming to get some wheat, and they kill him. They strike him in the belly. And then they come into the house. He's lying in his bedroom. They kill him. They behead him. They took his head, traveled all the way to the south part of the Dead Sea, and then made their way up into the Hebron Plateau. It says, then they brought the head of Ishbosheth at Hebron in verse 8. Now they bring this head. David knows that God is going to give him the kingdom. Samuel's already told him that years before. David has learned through 2 times when he could have killed Saul that that's not how to do it. Now these men are standing in front of him boasting that they have the head that will essentially give him the northern tribes. David doesn't want it that way. Why doesn't he want it that way? Why doesn't he want to just take the throne, take the crown, give him a reward, send him home? Why is David resistant to this? He knew that God didn't want him in any way involved. He knew that God wanted to give him a kingdom, not have him think he earned it, stole it. Look, one of the great things about the blessing of God is when God blesses you and you have a sense that there's no way you could have pulled it off, your thankfulness is deeper and richer, and your walk with God grows. When you're not sure because you got so talented it might have been your talent that did it, you'll never be clear whether God gave it to you or whether you took it. I'm not against talent. I think talent is necessary, but I think a lot of people can't tell how they got to where they are because they can't ferret out the difference between their talent and God's blessing. When you know you're not good at something and God opens it, I was standing in South Africa. I was speaking to a group of people in a question and answer time. I will never forget this as long as I live. They asked me a question, and as God is my witness, I did not know the answer to the question. I opened my Bible, and there on the page was the question and the answer in my hand. I am not kidding. There was the question, and there was the answer. And I looked at this, and I said, I need you all to give me a moment. And I looked down, and I read the question, and I read the answer, and I thought, wow, when did I write this? I don't ever remember writing this. Now, clearly I wrote it. It's in my hand, but I don't know when. At that moment, I said, first I want to answer the question, then I want to stop for a minute and explain something to you. So I answered the question. It was a very detailed question. It came out of Levitical law, and I was in a group of people who were Messianic, and they had asked a very specific question. That's why I turned to that specific passage, but when I looked at it, I didn't even remember the question, let alone the answer, and had both in front of me. And then I stopped and said, I want to tell you all something that none of you are going to believe. Not one of you will believe what I'm saying. If you walk up here and look in my Bible, you'll see your question and my answer in my writing. I have no knowledge of when I wrote that. I'm going to take it that God told me to write that down years ago so that you would ask it this day. Today, God just did something. He did something in this room. He did something right in front of you, and you're not going to see it unless I tell you. And then we went right on. I will never forget that day. If you've ever been in this ridiculously tough situation that you could not extricate yourself from and God just lets you out, you will know that it happened. I can look back on my life and see about 10 of those, where God stepped in and did something, and I knew I didn't do it. I knew it wasn't me. You need to mark those in your life. Stick them in the back of your Bible. Write them down if you think you're going to forget them. There are moments in your life where you're going to blow it, and God's going to step in and save you. And then you're going to go, wow, God just stepped in and saved me. Don't forget those. This is one for David. David has a choice. There's a fork in the road right here. David can grab the throne and take over all 12 tribes. David can force them into an agreement. They don't have a king. Their king is headless. But that's not what he does. First thing he does is to be consistent with what God told him in relationship to Saul. He had to be consistent with Saul's child. And so he said, you've removed his head, and he was an innocent man. He did nothing wrong. I just put on a public display over Abner's death. You think I'm on the other side of this? I'm not. And then he had them killed. Why did he have them killed? Why was that okay? They murdered a king. They lifted the hand against the Lord's anointed. And David said, nobody gets to kill kings. That's when he's ready to be one. He's ready to get the job when he respects the job at that level. This is one of the reasons I'm concerned about people who demean a president in a presidential election. Don't demean the office. Don't demean the office. You don't know. How many of you remember when the current president said things about the previous president and he was going to walk in and change everything, and we still have at Guantanamo a prison that was going to be closed 7 years ago? Some of you were just kids, you don't even remember it. Here's the truth. It always looks easy from the cheap seats. When you get the job, that's when you know the job. And so David is speaking like a king before he becomes one. Don't you dare try to pull off justice by yourself. That's not going to fly in this kingdom, ever. Now, chapter 5 then plays right into this, because now David is going to take first steps as the kingship is falling into his lap. I really believe David was as surprised as everyone else that it was finally happening. I count more than 12 years at least since he was told he was going to be king. Now you got to remember, when the average life expectancy is 42 to 52 years, if you've gone 12 years since you've been told you were going to be king and you're king-elect, and it's taken at least 12 years to get to it, a big chunk of David's life has been on the run, and now God is making good what Samuel said long ago. Look at chapter 5. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and your flesh. They came to offer thanks. They came and noticed that he received the accolades from others, and the reputation was given by others. He doesn't rise and take the throne. They give it to him. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were one who led Israel out and in. Look at the fact that he built it on the gift of others. Look at the fact that he built on the testimony of the pattern of service of his life. Listen to me. Some of you will have great ministries, but only if you begin now the patterns of service that build a testimony so people know to count on you. And on the basis of that, David, he's the one who let us out, let us in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over my people. Did you notice? They gave him the throne based on his testimony and based on their interpretation of the Word of God and the promises of God. If David's life didn't line up with the Word of God, they couldn't have said the end of verse 2. But because he worked within the Word, they could apply the Word to him. Now, in verse 3, it says, so all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron, and they anointed David king over Israel. You have to understand what just happened. They made a covenant, meaning they agreed to join David's household as their king. But that covenant would have to be renewed by Solomon. That covenant would have to be renewed by Rehoboam. Every king after David would have to re-win the hearts of the tribes. And it didn't last long. One son, and then it was pretty much over. So take a look at what happens. They make an agreement before God to hold themselves accountable to David and hold David as their king. And David was 30 years old when he became king and reigned 40 years. When somebody asks me, how do you know it was like a dozen years that he was out on the run? If you take the fact that David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years, so he's 70 about when he dies, and then you go back to the fact that he was a teenager when he was first brought in, that's how you come up with an understanding that it's got to be somewhere between 12 and 18 years between the time Samuel anoints him and the time he becomes king. Okay? The problem with there's a 7-year gap because he's king at Hebron over Judah before he's king over Israel. So the question is, do you count back to where he becomes king over Judah, or do you count back to where he's king over the whole land? And I simply don't know. So it's 12 to maybe as much as 17, 18 years. Okay? Look at verse 5. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. And what you see is that there were tangible results of the blessing of God on David's life. Because he didn't feel the need to take what God promised him, he let God give it to him. I want to say this. This is going to sound like a ridiculous application of this passage, but it's not. Some of you are called to be great moms. Don't jump the gun. Let God give you the man he wants you to have. Don't go get one. Now, by that, I don't mean be passive. I mean, first of all, be where guys are, okay? Because, you know, finding them requires finding them, and they're not all that bright. So you're going to have to make it really clear who you are and how good you are. But the second part is, in doing that, understand, wait for God's signals. Don't jump the gun on this. Because I got to tell you, there's something worse than not finding a man, and that's finding the wrong one, okay? Because you're going to live with that choice. Now, look at verse 6. It says, the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. And they said to David, you shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will turn you away. This is the taking of Jerusalem. So next to verse 6, you might write, the taking of Jerusalem. Now, look at the lessons David is learning. The first lesson he learned in chapter 5 was he had to learn to wait to let other people give him what God promised him. You cannot grab leadership. People bestow leadership. Look, you can earn a title, but it's not until they give you leadership that they're following. There are plenty of people with leadership titles that aren't leading anybody. Nobody's following them. Leadership is bestowed by people. The title isn't, but the leadership is. So he has to learn, as all the tribes came and they decided that he would be their king. The other thing I noticed is that David could become king over them when they saw him as one of them. Did you notice back in the beginning of chapter 5, you are bone and flesh with us? Some people think that the way to become a leader is to try and look different than everyone else. Jesus said the way to be a leader is to serve everyone else. Be one of them and be the servant of all. David understood that he was there to serve, not to rule. That his service was ruling. That's what it would be. The other thing I notice is that while you let them acknowledge your faithfulness, you have to remember to continue to trust the one that you trusted that got you there. So they're running around going, David, verse 2, David led us in and out. David did all this. But David has to not read his own press and believe David did what David is said to have done. You don't have to run around going, oh, that really wasn't me. It was. It was you. But you have to say what's true. I follow God. This is not because I'm a good guy, okay? That's not what happened. Samuel came, he anointed me. I was out there watching sheep. All of a sudden, I'm thrust into this situation with Saul, and all this stuff has happened. Listen to me. Those who have accomplished the most for God in life that I have sat and personally talked to have told me the same story over and over. They saw God's hand in their life, but they couldn't tell you how it actually works. There was no book they read that it was step 1, do this, step 2, do this, step 3, do this, and now you're in charge. There are things you need to learn. There are principles for sure of leadership. But the bottom line is you don't wrestle out of God's hand the title. God placed it in his life. what I thought was interesting is that look how accountable he was. Look at verse 3 when you have just a simple statement, before the Lord. They made a covenant with him before the Lord. That David's life is being framed in the beginning as a God thing. This isn't just people making politics. This is before the Lord. There is a spiritual element to the whole thing. And you should sense that. David begins here in a spiritual way. Before God, people come to him and say, before God, we're going to submit to you. What I think is interesting is that the next thing he has to do is he has to start to build up some systems that are going to work. Now, the very first steps David is going to take are going to be to build systems that are going to play out for the next 5 chapters.